Very similar to the college to career lecture, this is something that could fit in any class, but it's one of those things that doesn't fit in the college curriculum, but is something that's useful to put an analytic kind of political economy framework around, right? To think through the winners, the losers, the trade-offs, kind of in this rigorous way that we're learning to pursue in this class. Perhaps oddly, the first thing I want to talk about in terms of the economics of personal finance is I want to talk about the emotional component, right? That when we make decisions, financial decisions that in retrospect are poor decisions, we rarely make those mistakes, or we do not primarily make those mistakes because of ignorance of the economics. Now, I mean, a detailed understanding of the economics will help us make better decisions. But often sort of the worst financial decisions we make in our life, from our own perspective, kind of in retrospect, are ones that are made for emotional reasons, right? Well, and we also make a lot of very good financial decisions for emotional reasons. But we often don't understand fully the way the social and emotional sort of factors are playing into how we allocate the money that we spend and how we think about saving and how we think about earning. So one of the things that happens that you probably already see happen in your life, if you sort of think back, is that a lot of your spending decisions, and this is maybe a little bit less so at a time when you're largely trapped inside a home, but a lot of spending decisions are made jointly with other people, but we aren't talking about the spend part of the decision. So this is true when you're deciding what to go do with your friends on a Friday night, right? And you're like, oh, are we going to go to this place? Are we going to go to that place? We're going to go to this place. It might be that one of these options costs no money or very little money, and other options are very expensive. But you're talking about what you want to go do, often without being like, hey, guys, what's your budget for tonight, right? So it's the conversation doesn't necessarily even cover the relative costs of a particular outing, but the decision that is being made as the group is a decision about how much each person in that group is going to spend tonight, right? Same thing about deciding where to go for lunch, what to do for spring break, whether a group of friends are all going to live together. And if we're going to live together, what kind of a place would we get, right? These are, I mean, particularly that decision about housing, that's perhaps your largest financial decision of the year. But a lot of times the conversations are about who do you want to live with and how do we want to, how close to campus, this and that, but really focusing on like, what's your budget? What's my budget? What can, what makes sense for us financially? It's hard to do that. We have, many of us are raised not to talk about money, right? And that's sort of an ingrained value, is that money is something you don't talk about. Well, like that has upsides and downsides. And when you're making collective decisions as a group of friends or as a family, as an extended family, if you're not talking about the money piece, then that can lead to some people being in a really difficult situation, or some people making decisions that aren't very sound financially. So thinking about how do I want to be able to talk about money with my friends, with my romantic partners, with your siblings and your parents, right? As you guys move forward in life, some of you are already living with romantic partners. Some of you may begin to live with romantic partners in the next few years. Some of you may, over the coming years, will consider marriage, right? Which is, among other things, marriage is a very long-term financial contract, right? And, so figuring out a way to communicate openly about money with the people that are close to you, the people with whom you are making joint financial decisions, can be a very important step toward making better financial decisions. Sometimes you're going to be sort of needing to do is to sort of figure out how to manage your spending, right? You're going to say, okay, I need to figure out a way to spend within my means, right? So you've got a certain amount of income coming in, you got to figure out how not to spend more than that, right? You have some savings goals or you have some other financial stability goals. Meeting those often, one of the things that people struggle with is, how do I manage my spending? How do I limit my spending? right? The key thing I'll point to there is sort of a piece of, so everything I'm going to do is to put a little bit of social science around these things. You'll get a lot of advice from this from family. You'll get, we'll talk about hiring a financial advisor at some point in your life, right? But what I can do in this lecture is put a little bit of social science in here. And one key piece of social science, and actually Wendy Wood in the psychology department at USC was one of the key researchers who's done a lot of this stuff on habits, a lot of the key sort of foundational research on habits, is that so human beings are creatures of habit and ritual. Habits and rituals are extremely important in guiding our behavior. And humans almost never get rid of a habit. You can say, oh, I want to stop doing X. That rarely works. What you need to do is replace one habit with another is much, much more effective. So it's not, I want to stop, and I hate this example and it's way overused, but I want to stop, getting a latte every day, right? Okay. What are you going to do instead, right? What's going to be the replacement? Or I want to stop going out to eat for lunch every day, or I want to stop, running up big bar tabs on the weekends. Okay, what are you going to replace that with? Because if it comes to Friday night and you're like, I don't want to go out to a bar because that gets expensive, the key thing is to already have in place, what are you going to be doing on Friday nights instead? There's a certain set of needs that you're meeting that way. How are you going to meet those needs through a different set of habits, right? How can you get the same social, these other things at a lower price point? Figure out what's the cheaper habit or ritual you can replace it with. Not just I'm going to stop doing that, but what am I going to replace it? That's going to be a lot more effective. Let's talk about investments in your own career. A lot of what I'm going to be talking to you about right now is managing debt, right? Right now, so if you think about different sort of financial phases, you guys right now are generally at a debt financing phase. If you're making long-term investments in your future earning potential, that's what you're doing when you're in college. You're generally not earning much money. Most people, while they're in school, are earning less than what they're spending. There are some people who are managing to be self-sufficient financially while in school. That is exceptionally hard to do. And those people are working their tail off trying to do a full-time course load and make enough to live on. That's incredibly hard. Some people can pull it off. It is very, very difficult to do. So most of you are debt financing a fair amount of your lifestyle, or your parents are financing your lifestyle right now, right? So when you're debt financing your life, right, when you're debt financing your day-to-day expenses, like how are you you're thinking about debt financing future earnings, right? Undergraduate degrees tend to pay pretty well. You debt finance them, but they do pay off over time. But you want to, you're debt financing enough to live on at the margins, but thinking about so you've decided to take on a certain amount of debt to fund the education piece. What are the other things that you might debt finance early on in your career that might make sense, that might pay off well, right? You might debt finance a great unpaid internship over the summer, right? So you can choose over the summer, am I going to go wait tables or be a lifeguard or something like that? I'm going to just pay the bills and I'm going to make as much money as I can over the summer. When I was in college, for a number of summers, I would go work trail crew for the Forest Service. And so for like June through about mid-July, I'd be working and building trails. And by about mid-July, fire season would have really picked up and I would be out fighting forest fires and making a bunch of hazard pay and overtime. I'd work like 13, 16-hour days in a row, which is kind of insane, but pays really well, or at least it feels that way when you're 20 years old. So I'd go make as much money as I could over the summers. And then I got to my junior year and it was coming up on that summer between junior and senior year. And I essentially had a conversation with the professor who was my honors thesis advisor. And she was like, look, you got to be done fighting fire over the summer. I know it feels like good money right now, but you need to make a long-term investment in your career if you can afford it, right? You need to go take an internship this summer, especially if you have some good internship options, and do something that's going to sort of pay in the long run, right? And so I ended up interning at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that summer, which helped me get into graduate school, which kind of like launched my career, right? Whereas another summer in the Forest Service, I could make good money doing that, what was good money for my earning potential at the time, but it wasn't leading to my career, and I needed to take on some debt that summer, give up that earning opportunity to move my career forward, and that was a worthwhile thing to do. Also, you can think about it at critical career junctures in and around graduate school, things like this. foregoing side jobs, right? Sometimes you might be in a job that's not paying very well and you've got a second job on top of it. But when is it you really need to excel at that first job or excel at that junior year of college, right? Where you're foregoing that side job, the extra job at the library, or the extra job as, the extra job waiting tables, or whatever you're kind of doing during the school year, or during, as a second job on top of your first one to make money, to allow you to really invest in being truly excellent at that primary job. And then another thing that you guys may be looking at some point in the next, 10, 15 years anyway, is how much to spend on childcare, right? Where often people are having kids fairly early in their careers. You're not particularly flush at that time, right? And childcare is really expensive. But paying for more childcare has the upside of giving you more time to really excel at your job. So that was certainly an issue for me and my wife when we started having the kids you just saw, if you were logged on early. My eldest son, Zeke, who was just on, he was born the summer between my 5th and 6th year of my PhD program. So he was born in May, right before I was going on the job market. So as a graduate student, I was making somewhere in the ballpark of $17,000 a year, right? So that was my very high income as a doctoral student, right? And my wife at the time was a law student, so her income was negligible, right? We were essentially just debt financing her law degree, and we were deciding whether during that time to be paying for childcare when neither of us were making much, when essentially we were debt financing that childcare. And we decided to debt finance a fair amount of childcare, and we got, as inexpensive a childcare as, we're in a little in-home daycare, but it was childcare to allow me to work harder on my side projects, to get applications out, to really have better earnings in the short term. I could have still finished my degree consuming less childcare, right? Doing more of the childcare ourselves and paying for less of it. But we were making that long-term investment of paying for childcare now to buy time to pursue excellence, right? And so that's kind of what you're doing, is what can I debt finance my own professional excellence right now in ways that are going to pay dividends long term. And so, it's not something to do casually, right? Taking on debt is not something. You've got to be investing rather than, taking on debt to just consume leisure, right, is really, really risky. But taking on debt to invest in your career can pay off very, very robustly. That's probably, even in narrow financial terms, not to mention sort of overall well-being terms, some of the best, the best financial investments my wife and I ever made. A lot of you will be fielding your first full-time job offers fairly soon. Within the next 2 to 3 years, you guys will be negotiating for your first full-time salary. And I just, then I've talked to a number of students in this past winter, the fall and winter, through negotiating their first salaries. And one fact to be aware of, just percentage-wise, men are more likely to negotiate their starting salary than women. Keep in mind that your entire lifetime earnings can end up benchmarked off of your first salary, right? Because when you apply for another job and you get another job offer, one of the questions you are often asked during that salary negotiation is, well, what were you making at your last job, right? And even if they don't ask, if they give you an offer that is lower than what you're currently making or about the same, you can tell them what you're currently making as part of the leverage to get them to offer you more, right? So what you make now, what you make in that first job, it doesn't just matter that, oh, you have an extra $2,000 or $3,000 a year or an extra $5,000 a year in salary right then. But that can translate to an extra, 5% of salary, an extra 3% of salary every year for the rest of your life because of the way things are benchmarked off of your early earnings. So it's worth negotiating that starting salary. So some key things to keep in mind. They've made you a job offer. Once you have an offer in hand, so you don't want to start negotiating salary before you have a job offer. It is once they've made you an offer of employment, right? So you do not want to start negotiating this beforehand. Don't start talking about the salary until after you have a job offer in hand. But once you have a job offer in hand, you're allowed to negotiate that, and they will not rescind the offer just because you negotiate, right? We've had if you are a senior right now and you have a job offer that you haven't signed, sign it, right? So in times of crisis and immediate downturn, the one sort of caveat here is in times of crisis, sometimes firms do rescind offers because their whole financial outlook has changed. So we have had some situations with students, this year, and this is, an unusually severe crisis, which is not to say you won't live through another one like it in your lifetime or in your professional career, but it is a pretty unusual time. But this is a situation where people have had offers extended to them that are then rescinded if they didn't sign them really quickly, just because in that couple of weeks when you're negotiating, the whole world fell out from underneath the firm and they were like, oh shit, we can't employ anybody. That's given the absence of that kind of event. Once that offer's been extended to you, you have a little bit of time to negotiate with them, and you can ask for a little bit more money, and they're not going to be like, oh, then forget you, right? That's not how it goes. So it is okay to negotiate that first salary, and it's important to negotiate. If you're going to negotiate your first salary, when you're heading into that, you do your homework, whether it's via Glassdoor or via the USC Alumni Network and trying to talk to somebody who's already employed there. You want to understand what is the normal salary for somebody in this position. What's the range that other people at this firm and at other firms doing similar work get paid? So you don't want to ask for something that's unreasonable, right? You want to understand where you're at in that general spectrum. Are you down at the lower end of the scale, or are you already up at the top end of the scale for that type of position? That allows you to know how much you can ask for. But usually it's a safe bet. If you are asking for 5% more than their initial offer, you're not going to offend anybody with that ask, right? And if they're offering you way down at the low end of the scale, it could be okay to ask for 25% more. If the range is here and they're offering you here and you ask for this instead, that, even if that's 25% more than what you're asking them the range of the position. So you ask, but you don't demand. You don't say, give me this or else, right? You say, you say a bunch of nice things about hey, I'm really excited about this job, all these things about the career, about the opportunities at your organization. I really like the people I interviewed with. I'm really excited about this. Is it possible, that you could go to this level for the salary? You make that ask, then they'll come back with a counter, right? And usually you go 2 rounds on this. So they give you a salary offer and you say, wow, I'm so excited about this offer. I'm really excited about this firm. But could you, you offered me $60K a year. Could you do $63,000 a year, right? And then they come back to you and they say, well, we can't do $63,000 a year, but we could do, we can do 61. And you say, well, okay, thank you so much for being willing to move and work with me on this. If we can get to 61.5, I'll sign and we'll call it a day, right? So you can go 2 rounds, or you can just say 61 sounds great and sign there. But you don't want to go more than 2 rounds. You don't want, if they come back, if you say, can you do, 61.5, and they say, well, I'll do 61.200. You don't go one more round after that, right? You just, at that point, if it's a job you want, you just accept. So it's sort of a 2 round is sort of a good rule of thumb on the negotiating as kind of a max. Another, and then the last thing I want to say about negotiating is, so a couple more things I want to say. One is, you don't have to negotiate over the phone. You can pick your modality. You can choose to do this negotiation over the phone. And some people are really good on the phone, and doing things by conversation or in person is how they prefer to do it. Me, I feel so guilty trying to negotiate in person. And I remember this was my first offer from USC when I was hired by USC. I was trying to negotiate my first salary with the chair of the department, and we started into a phone conversation, and I felt so guilty asking for more money, because I was like, but this is already such a good job, and I feel like this is already a lot of money, and I know I'm supposed to negotiate for more, but I just feel like I should just be grateful for this. I could not do it in person. And so I said, you know what? I was like, I really, really appreciate having this offer on the table. I'm going to need a day to think about this, and can I correspond with you about this over email? I need a little space to wrap my head around this. And it's okay to move from phone or in person and to do it by email where you have a little more space. That also gives you time to get input from other people. I am happy to help you with this. I'm not a brilliant negotiator, but if you need somebody to talk you through your first salary negotiation in a year or 3 years or 4 years, shoot me an email. I'll get on the phone with you. I'll talk to you about it. Like I said, I've done this for, half a dozen students already this year. But your parents can be helpful, an uncle, another professor, any mentor, or even your friends who have recently been through it. right? But having somebody else, you can be like, hey, can you read this email? Am I getting this right? Hey, they offered this. What do I do? If you're just in a conversation like by phone and it's like happening live, you can't get that outside input. But if you're doing it by email, it gives you time to get that advice on each round of it, so you kind of can get it right. So that's why I prefer the emails, because you can get help and advice from other people. And at the end of the day, even if they say no, it wasn't a mistake to negotiate. So it might be they offered you $60,000 a year. You said, hey, can you do 63? And they say, no, 60,000 is final offer. Sorry, take it or leave it. We've got no flexibility here. That's fine, right? Now you get a chance to take it or leave it. Maybe you have another offer and you go take it, or maybe you don't and you take that 60,000, or maybe, you would have done this job for 40 and, 60 is great. It's still not a bad thing that you asked for 63. Like, go through that negotiating. It's okay. So that's my big thing on negotiating, is do it rather than not doing it. You can do it by email. You can get advice. It's okay to ask. Another financial decision you guys are going to be facing, I'm kind of running through what are the big financial decisions you guys make as students. So we're going to talk a lot about debt. We're going to talk about first jobs. We're going to talk about insurance, because you guys are already making decisions about what insurance to buy or not, right? And so why do we buy insurance? Why is insurance all a good idea? It allows you to reduce volatility, right? So you're offloading some of your risk onto a big company, a big diversified company that can handle the risk. We talked about when you're low income, volatility can be really, really painful, right? A negative drop in income or a major expense can drop you into that catastrophe zone where you're having trouble making rent or paying for enough to eat or that kind of thing, right? And so insurance allows us not to get dropped into that catastrophe zone. It moves that risk onto a big diversified insurer that can handle the volatility, and that is diversified across so many people that the volatility is actually smoothed out. So that's what we're doing when we contract with insurance. So the one key thing I'll say that will come up for you guys sooner than most other things, so there's like things you will get insurance on. You'll get insurance on cars, you get insurance on houses, you'll get insurance on your own life. You buy life insurance, obviously not for you, but for the people who are dependent on you, right? You're dead, but if that contract's going to pay out. But you get it for the people who are financially dependent on you. And I just will say, when you have kids, as soon as you find out that you or your partner is pregnant, that's the time you buy life insurance. You don't wait until after the kid is born. You don't wait until they're 3. You buy it right then, as soon as you find out that there's a pregnancy, right? Because if you die the next day, that kid still exists, right? And so you want to have that contract in place before they're born, right? So that person, that new life that's coming to the world, has financial security even if you vanish, right? So that your partner has financial security even if you vanish, and the ability to raise that kid on their own, right? You're setting up for, life insurance is something you buy for the people who depend on you. Some of you may end up buying life insurance not for your dependents, but not for your children, but for your parents or a sibling, right? You may have somebody else in your life who's financially dependent on you who is not your child. A fair number of you will be in a position where your parents are dependent on you, or another family member, right? So you can buy life insurance with your parents as the beneficiary, or with your friend as a beneficiary, with your romantic partner as a beneficiary. If there is somebody else who's financially dependent on you, life insurance can be a good idea. When you're young and you're healthy, it's pretty inexpensive, and it covers that catastrophic downside risk. Okay. The other thing, so what you're doing here, you're offloading risk onto somebody else. But on average, those insurance companies make money, which means on average, the average person pays in more in premiums than they collect in insurance payouts. So these are contracts you want to enter into, by and large, only if you need to manage that downside risk, or if you have private information that says you're a much worse risk than you seem on paper, right? So if you are somebody who breaks their phone every 3 months with regularity, okay, then you might want to insure a phone. But otherwise, you probably want to self-insure, meaning you want to be like, when your phone breaks, you're the one who replaces it, and you keep some savings, right? So sort of the alternative to an insurance policy for smaller things is enough savings to cover those expenses, right? And early on in your life, right, your car may be a pretty essential asset, and you may not be able to keep you know, $10,000 in savings to be able to buy a new used car if you wreck the one you have. So you may need to pay the extra for that collision coverage on your car insurance because you can't have enough savings to cover that downside risk. As you get farther into your career and you can keep a rainy day fund when you are making enough money to have that ability to self-insure, it's like first, you know, you stop insuring smaller things because, you know, on average the house wins, right? And so so you can stop carrying collision insurance on your car and instead have enough money sitting in a bank account such that if you get into a wreck, you can replace it yourself. Obviously, you still have to cover liability insurance and that thing. You know, there's some car insurance you have to pay. The optional part is the collision insurance that replaces your own car if you get in a wreck. And you can choose not to have that coverage. So you think about whether you want to self-insure or pay for the insurance. Things like phone insurance are pretty much a terrible idea for most people most of the time. If you're, you know, because they cost, you know, the average consumer pays more in insurance than they get back if they break their phone. Deductibles are so high, it's already very expensive to replace your phone. You guys are taking on a lot of debt in this time of life, or many of you are. Two types of debt you generally want to avoid holding if at all possible. Payday loans, you don't want to take out if you can possibly avoid because they have monumentally high interest rates. And card debt has very high interest rates. You don't want to be carrying a balance on your credit card. Have a credit card, but pay it off every month. If you need to debt finance something, don't debt finance with your credit card. Now you can, you know, 0% APR cards, like 0% interest rate cards for, you know, there'll be these promo rates where you'll be able to cover purchases for 6 months or 12 months. You can use those 0% rates and they can be a good deal if you are religious about paying it off before that rate jumps up to 30%. Right? What credit cards are banking on when they offer you that 0% APR is that you will take on the debt now and you will intend to pay it off during that promotional rate window, but then you won't be able to, or you'll forget to, and the rate will kick up to 17% or 30%, and you'll be paying astronomical interest on that loan for a while before you finally get it paid off. That's what the credit card company is banking on. So you can take on that 0% APR debt if you are really confident you're going to stay on top of it and pay it back before that rate kicks up. But in general, credit card debt is something you want to avoid, especially because you have access to some other types of debt that are a much better deal. So any debt that is backed by an asset is going to be much less expensive, right? So debt backed by a car is often relatively inexpensive. Dealerships will often offer you 0% financing to get you to purchase through them. So like GM or a company like that is also a major lender. They're not just a car manufacturer. They're also a very large bank that does a lot of their own lending. But they'll give you a cheap interest rate instead of giving you a good price on the car. So often you'll notice like you have a choice between like cash back or 0% APR or whatever in the deal, right? So it's if you have, you're better off often rather than taking that 0% financing, taking the cash back if you can do that instead, and having a slightly higher interest rate coming from a bank. You know, right now, especially right now, interest rates are extremely low. You can get car loans at, you know, 1.5% interest or something like that right now. So you're better off usually going to a bank and getting that loan and then going into the dealership. So you go get pre-approved for the loan from a bank, and then you go into the dealership or to the used car lot or whatever with that loan already in hand, right? Or with that sort of pre-approval already in hand. So you want to shop. Don't just take the credit from the dealership because it's easy. Go shop around at a couple of banks and get the best rate you can. You guys are also, many of you, taking on student debt. Now, student debt is also pretty low, pretty relatively low rates, certainly compared to like credit card debt. The reason it's cheaper than credit card debt is because you can't get out of it. With credit card debt, if you run up a ton of credit card debt, you get way in a hole, you can go bankrupt, right? And you can get that debt forgiven. You know, it takes 7 years for that then to wipe off your, you know, so for 7 years, you'll have trouble getting access to other credit. You'll be paying very high interest rates for any additional debt you take on, but you have this option of going bankrupt and wiping out your credit card debt. Even if you go bankrupt, your student debt does not go away. It follows you to the grave. So you have to be careful about how much student debt you take on, but it generally is at a lower interest rate. Because you can't default on it, the risk for the lender is lower. Okay. So if you have, so student debt kind of comes in two categories. There's subsidized, federally subsidized loans, which often are at like a 2 to a 3% interest rate. That's really inexpensive money. You don't have to rush to pay that off. Keep that, it'll come on a 10-year repayment schedule usually after you graduate, sometimes even longer. You'll be able to postpone it while you're in graduate school, that kind of stuff. Yeah, hang on to that debt. Don't be in a rush to pay that off. I mean, make your monthly payments on time. But if you have a chance to defer it for a couple of years in grad school or whatever, you don't have to, you have some extra savings. You don't have to pump that into paying that off early, right? Leave that debt sitting there. It's really cheap debt, right? If you've got some unsubsidized student loans, generally you want to pay that back before you make any non-matched retirement savings. We're going to talk about retirement savings in a little bit here. Keep that, go ahead and you're better off pumping some of your extra money into retirement savings rather than paying off those subsidized loans early. But that's not really true with this. Once you're up at that 6 to 9% rate, that's a better return than you're going to make in the market, right? So we think about what's the risk-free return you can get in the market, right? I don't know. And right now it's pretty low, but in general, it's going to be at least better than 2%. But it's not going to be better than 6 to 9%. So you want to pay back those loans pretty much as soon as you can. Almost never give matched retirement saving, we're about to talk about, but otherwise that's one of your highest priority things to save money for, is to pay off your student debt early. However, that student debt, when you're taking it on, that 6 to 9% already prices in the fact that you might not get a job after you graduate. If you graduate and get a job, suddenly you've identified yourself in being in the lower risk of two groups. There's the students who graduated and didn't get jobs. They're a higher risk to default on their student loans or to be unable to be late paying and that kind of thing. You just got a job. You're now lower risk, which means, you know what? You can claim a lower interest rate by refinancing. If you refinance your student debt after you've got a job in hand, right, you can generally get a lower rate than what you currently have. Granted, I mean, my wife is a very secure bet at this point. She's a federal attorney, right? But what's left of her law school debt is refinanced at down around 2.5%, right? Not up at 6 or 9%. It's not federally subsidized even. That's from a bank, that refinanced that debt, because she's a lock to pay that off right now because she has a good job, right? And so once you have a good job, once you have any job at all, sort of a regular W-2, you can, which is the tax form you get for your salary, you can probably refinance that student debt for below 6 to 9%. You can bring it down to a lower interest rate. Yeah, so that's the student debt stuff. Be careful with how much you take on. Taking on a lot of extra student debt to live in a fancier apartment, that kind of thing, is it's a risky bet. You have then, the more debt you've taken on, the more limited you are in what professional choices you can make later. That you have to be able to earn enough to pay that debt off, because that debt, you can't get bankrupt to get rid of it. All right. There is something out there called the Personal Finance Index Card, which is just, it's kind of like the conventional wisdom financial advice you would get from a financial planner, fits entirely on a 3x5 note card, right? And I've got the last slide in this deck is all 9 points from that note card, but I just want to I actually want to talk through some of the points here. And so these are kind of the basics of managing your personal finances. The first one is to max out your 401k or your employer-sponsored retirement contributions. So a lot of employers will have a retirement plan where if you put aside 5% of your income in retirement, they will match that with 5% of your salary from them, right? And so what that means is when you save for retirement, you get 100% interest rate the moment you put it in. Boom, your money is doubled, right? So if you save $2,000 that year, your employer also puts $2,000 into your retirement account. You don't want to miss that match. That match is the best investment you're ever going to get. So find a way to save the money that your employer is going to match. If they'll match 5% of your salary, save that full 5%. Just check that box on your sort of payment elections when you take that first job, if you can possibly do it. I know a lot of you will be very financially constrained early in your career. and you may graduate college already being financially responsible for parents or siblings. And it may be impossible to do that some years, but that is the best investment opportunity you'll ever get. Don't miss it if you can possibly keep it. And then 401ks are kind of, related to this. So it's anything that the employer is matching. You want to take advantage of if you can. If you are going to be putting aside money in retirement savings, right, you want to buy a cheap, diversified mutual fund, right? Not a hedge fund, not a actively managed fund. For the average person, the thing you want is just a cheap index fund. Vanguard is the company that kind of pioneered these, but most of the major brokerages now offer a passively managed fund with really low fees, right? The reason you go for these index funds is that they have a very low management fee. You pay maybe like 0.1 or 0.15% per year to the company to manage your funds. Whereas with an actively managed fund, you may pay 1%, 1.5%. For a hedge fund, you might be paying 3% plus some percentage of earnings, right? You're paying financial analysts to make moves with your money for you. And most actively managed funds, most of the time, can't beat the market by enough to cover the fees that they're charging you. Most of them underperform market plus fees. So most actively managed funds in most years cost their investors money. Most stockbrokers are, and hedge fund managers and those folks, most of them are not worth their investors are paying on average over time. Now, fear of missing out is a real thing, right? And when and if you have a friend who's invested in a hedge fund or invested in some actively managed fund or was buying individual stocks, when they win, essentially when they have a big return, you'll probably hear about it. The year that they lose their shirt, you probably won't hear about it. And so this fear of missing out, that you should be in a more aggressive investment and really seizing this amazing opportunity, it is really hard to hear about other people making 25% on their money or this and that when you're making 6% or whatever. That FOMO is a real thing and it's hard to manage psychologically. But in the long run, there's, for most people, cheap, diversified index funds. I think I know a lot about the global economy, right? And yet I'm not picking emerging market bonds to invest in, and I'm not trading in Brazilian companies and Filipino companies, this, that, and the other thing, trying to play the market. I have my money sitting in an index fund like anybody else, right? Like just dumb money, just sitting there in an index fund tracking the S&P 500. It goes up, it goes down, and I just hands off, leave it in there. We've talked a little bit about never buying an individual stock or a bond, right? That there are people trading in the market, quite a lot of them, who have private information. And whether that's senators dumping their stocks right before, after they get a private briefing on coronavirus, or like classified briefing on coronavirus, or any other group of people that have inside information about what firms are doing, which is a lot of people, right? Those earnings reports come out publicly. There are literally hundreds of people who knew about that beforehand for each of those companies, right? If you're trying to trade against those people, you're going to lose. You're just, over time, you're going to lose unless you actually have access to your own private information, right? Unless you're doing something that borders on insider trading, you're consistently going to lose out to people who are doing things that border on or actually are insider trading. So, standing advice, never buy or sell an individual stock or bond. Somebody just chatted in a question, is now the time to put your savings in an index fund? So, I think so. Whether your funds go in the market, so if you are going to have your funds in the stock market, I would say it is always the time to have them in an index fund rather than an individual stock or bond. If it is money that you're planning to spend sometime soon, you probably want to hang on to it in cash, right? But if it's money that's, in a retirement fund or something that's going to sit there for a decade or more, if it's money that you're saving for a down payment on your first house and you think that that's probably going to be 10 years off, then yeah, I would say it's a good time to put it in, right? I mean, if I had to guess, I think the stock market's a little overvalued right now, so maybe I would hold off. But that's my guess. And I don't think trying to trade on your intuition like that is risky, right? And so I would say, look, if you're going to have it for 10 more years, yeah, buy into the market and sit on it. But if it's something you need sooner, then hang on to it in cash because you don't want the volatility. This is downside losses hurt more than upside gains benefit you, right? Because each marginal dollar that you have is less valuable than the last. It's like that first $10,000 allows you to buy a good used car and get to and from your job, right? If you don't have that $10,000, you're bus commuting every day and you're burning an hour a day. So it's like that first 10,000 is really valuable to you. So you don't want to lose that 10,000 bucks in the market, right? Even if you could have gotten an extra 3,000 above that, which would have allowed you to have a fancier car or something, which, yeah, would be nice. But the key thing is being able to get to and from your job, right? So it's like that first money matters more than the next. So those downside losses hurt more than the upside gains are beneficial. So don't take risks. Don't take big risks with money you're going to spend soon. If it's money you don't need for a long time, then you have time to ride out the market and collect those kind of average returns over time. So don't put it in the market at all if it's stuff you need soon. Then just hang on to it in cash, something really safe. A certificate of deposit, a money market fund, something where you're not going to lose the money, where you won't make much return on it. You're not going to get a lot of interest, but try to get a little bit of interest with very low risk if it's something you're going to need in the next 5 years. Do try to maximize. So you never want to miss out on employer matching for retirement, but there's also a bunch of tax advantaged ways to save for retirement where you don't have that same employer match, but you have some long-term tax benefits. These are things like IRAs and 529 for your kids' college. So in the long run, you want to take advantage of those if you can with savings that you have. That's less important than the employer contributions, but it's a good way to protect your retirement savings from taxes. And then the last one I'll mention is if you are going to pay for financial advice, make your financial advisor commit to a fiduciary standard. Now, so you can get financial advice from people without paying an upfront fee, but keep in mind they are getting paid one way or another, right? So either you may have a very transparent relationship with a financial advisor where you're paying them by the hour for their advice, or you may not be paying them anything, but they are getting paid by the company. Then they're selling you mutual funds or this and that, and they're getting paid by those mutual funds. So they're getting paid by the people whose investments they're steering you toward. That means they're not really working entirely in your best interest, right? Where they have an incentive to steer you to funds that are going to pay them money for having steered you there, right? Yes, they want you to make money. They want you to be happy and stay with them long term, but they also have incentives to push you here and not there, right? So you want to at least make your financial advisor commit to a fiduciary standard where they're not doing things that they know are not in your interest. But even that fiduciary standard is pretty lax. I have a personal preference for wanting a transparent relationship with anybody giving me financial advice where I want to pay them by the hour so I know what it's costing me. And then that way I get advice from them. And I want to pay somebody who is not getting a commission from any of the things they're selling me. Right, so I want to pay them instead of having the mutual funds or the brokerages paying them. How some of you early on in your careers, if you have parents who have a fair amount of money invested, you may be able to get free advice from your parents' financial advisors. Financial advisors will give free advice to people early on in their careers in the hopes that you will be a long-run client for them. You may not have hardly any money to invest right now, but in the future, you may have hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars to invest. And they're making a bet on this young USC graduate who needs advice right now and may invest a lot of money over the span of their life and will give that free advice right now. You'll often find, if you have parents who have a fair amount invested, their broker may well be willing to give you free advice. And even if you don't have a parental relationship with a firm, you may find that they'll give you free advice betting on the fact that you might be a client in the future. But just figure out how your advisor is getting paid and how that may affect the advice they're giving you. And the most transparent way is to pay somebody by the hour and somebody who promises not to take a commission from anybody that they're helping connect you with. That's going to be the most transparent way. But it means you've got to bite the bullet and pay a fee up front when, at a time when you don't have potentially a lot of money. The last sort of slide worth of stuff. I'm pretty sure that I want to cover is talking about master's degrees and graduate school in general, because that's a major investment that many of you guys are going to think about it making or not making after graduating, right? You've already decided to make a major financial investment in coming to USC, right? Do you want to make an additional financial investment in a master's degree? And a debt finance master's degree can be a very good investment in some cases. So one, if the program is free, if you've got a scholarship to a master's program, or if you've gotten into a PhD program, because most PhD programs are free. They're very hard to get into, but most good PhD programs are fully funded. Okay, those are almost always good investments. There's still an opportunity cost. And that means, the years that you spend in graduate school, you're not spending or earning money. I mentioned that, yes, okay, my graduate degree was free. I wasn't paying any tuition. But for the 6 years I spent pursuing my PhD, I was making around $18,000 a year, right? If I had taken my bachelor's degree out into the job market, I would have been making probably quite a lot more than that, right? So there was an opportunity cost of foregone earnings for those 6 years. But I wasn't paying anything in tuition, and I was getting paid enough to live on it. $18,000 subsidized housing and good healthcare is, not a bad thing when you're in your early 20s. It's worth debt financing a master's degree when you understand this is the job that I can get if I have this degree. I can't get it without this degree, and I'm pretty confident I want that job. Some people are already there right when they graduate undergrad. So some people might be really into computer science. They're like, yeah, no, I'm pretty confident I want to be a programmer. And, if I go get a master's degree in CS right now, I'm going to, I can hit a much higher tier of job and salary than I can with just a BS. So I'm going to go get that master's degree. I rarely worry about people who go get engineering master's degrees about whether those are going to pay off financially. Those are going to pay off financially, right? As long as you're pretty confident you want to be an engineer. Right? But if you take on an extra $80,000 in debt, or an extra $100,000 or $150,000 in debt to get a master's degree, and then you decide you don't want to be an engineer, that's going to be hard, right? If you decide, no, actually I wanted to be a high school teacher, or no, actually I wanted to be a social worker, it's going to be hard to pay back that $150,000 of extra debt you took on with your $40,000 a year salary as a social worker, right? Which, social workers do some of the most important work I can think of on the planet in terms of doing good for humanity. A good social worker is an amazing thing. But they don't get paid a lot by and large. And so it's tough to go into that field if you have a lot of debt, right? Okay. So think about whether it's a master's degree that's going to pay off for you, right? Going and getting a master's in creative writing that's debt financed is going to be tough, right? If you can get a scholarship to the Iowa Writers Workshop, it's an amazing thing to go do. Right, but or if you have a trust fund, or if your parents are willing to pay for it, go get that creative writing master's. But if you're going to debt finance it, be aware then you have to pay it off, and that's going to be really hard. Working as a writer and selling novels, it's possible that you're able to do that as a novelist, or as a playwright, or as a short story writer. But it's going to be, but the odds that you're trying to pay off that debt working side jobs that are not writing is fairly high. Okay, so the other thing is don't debt finance a master's to go explore stuff, or because school is really comfortable. Right? Most of you did really well in high school, which allowed you to get in here. You're probably, most of you are very good at being undergraduate students, and the job market is scary, and especially now with the way the economy, the job market is really scary right now. Going and staying in school seems very appealing just because it's safe and whatever. But if you're racking up a lot of debt doing it, that, again, you've got to know what's the job you can get with that degree and that you actually want to do it. Because if you go take on debt and get a law degree and decide you don't want to be a lawyer, or get an engineering degree and decide you don't want to be an engineer, then you're trying to pay off law school level debt or engineering school level debt with a job that pays much, much less than a lawyer or an engineer makes. And that's really painful. It's really, really painful. It can also make sense to go to graduate school because you need a student visa to stay in the U.S. Staying in the U.S. long enough to secure a green card can be a good long-term financial investment. And so getting a master's degree that allows you to get another round of student visa and allows you to keep searching for that firm that's going to sponsor you for a green card, that kind of thing, that can be money well spent. But those are kind of the contexts in which it makes sense as a good investment. What I really worry about are kids, students who, you know, pursue like that 5th year progressive degree just because it's more comfortable than heading into the job market. If you really want that master's degree and you have a purpose for that master's degree, by all means, go get it, right? If you're confident, again, that it unlocks professional opportunities that you're sure you want and that you wouldn't have otherwise. But don't do it just because it's more comfortable. Okay. I'll leave this slide, but I think I don't want to talk more at you, but I do want to take, you know, the next 15 minutes if people have questions they want to chat in. I'd love to do a little Q&A here, or that you want to speak in. So feel free to either sort of speak verbally or chat in questions if you have them. Yeah, let me know what kind of things you guys are struggling with or trying to figure out. Are used cars generally a better investment? Probably. So for most people, most of the time, I would say that's right. A car does diminish in value right when you drive it off the lot. So there is a problem known as the market for lemons, right? Where when a car driven, there's some probability that it's a lemon, some probability that it is a car that has persistent mechanical difficulties. If it is a car that has persistent mechanical difficulties, the probability that it ends up in the used car market is very, very high. So whatever the percentage of lemons is in the new car market, the percentage of lemons in the used car market is higher. So in that sense, it's a riskier investment. The probability that you buy a lemon is higher than when you buy a new car. However, if you think about like what's the cost per mile of owning a vehicle for the first 30,000 miles, for the next 30,000 miles, for the next 30,000 miles, that first 30,000 miles are the most expensive miles to drive a car. Now, they're a nice 30,000 miles because you're not worried at all about maintenance and kind of the cost and inconvenience of the car breaking down, because the probability of it breaking down those first 30,000 miles is really low. And as the car gets older, the probability that you end up on the side of a freeway and having to call a tow truck and you're late for work and that accelerates as you're driving older vehicles. So it's pleasant to drive a new car because it's super reliable. It's pleasant to drive a new car because the Bluetooth still works and is, you know, and the windows still go up and down smoothly and all those kinds of things, right? It has the latest, greatest technology. It has that new car smell, right? So they're more pleasant miles, but they're also more expensive miles. And so, so used cars are going to get you more miles driven for less money. But they're going to come with the inconvenience of breakdowns more often and with kind of less cutting edge technology in your car and that kind of stuff. But yeah, they're cheaper miles to drive. Also, it's a little bit more of a pain in the ass to shop for them. Shopping for a new car is super fun and easy. Shopping for a used car takes more work, and you've got to like take it into a mechanic for the inspection, and like, you know, it's more work to try to dodge the lemons and to really operate in that used car market. It's a little bit more stressful. But yeah, it's better value per mile. Okay. Tips for transitioning from a career in one field to a career in another. That's a good question because it's something most of you will do. You know, this is not, as you guys I'm sure have been told before, right? The standard model for my generation as well as for yours is no longer take a job at an organization, work for 25 or 30 years, get handed a gold watch and a retirement and a pension and walk out the door. Most of you will change firms multiple times in your career, and quite likely change fields as well. I was doing some work with Facebook a couple of years ago. My lab was collaborating with them on some projects, and I was working with some researchers there. So Facebook and other tech firms hire a fair number of social scientists to investigate different things. The woman who was my counterpart there, when I started working with her, had been at the firm she'd been at Facebook for 15 months. And she was just about to cross into the most senior 50% of Facebook employees. So at that time, half of Facebook employees had been there less than 15 months, right? The churn is just really, really high. Every 2 or 3 years, people are going and taking a new job, right? That the average Facebook employee was only staying there for like, you know, for about 2 years, maybe 3. And then you're on to the next firm. So people are changing jobs really rapidly. When you go to move from one field to another, this is actually a time when master's degrees can play a really important role, right? Grad school can be a great way to transition from one field to another. So I think MBAs are a good example here, where often there's a problem where you can't get into a top MBA program until you've had a great job, and you can't get a great job unless you've been into a top MBA program, and you kind of have like a chicken and egg problem. You have that a lot early on in your career. I'll also say, like, look, for really smart people who go on to be really successful, the modal professional experience in your early 20s is frustration. So if you are feeling frustrated within the first 2 or 3 years after graduation, and you're feeling like, I can't land a good job, I'm unhappy in the job I'm at, and I'm not even making that much money, clearly I'm a professional failure. No, you are experiencing what it's like to be a professional in your early 20s. So fortunately, now I'm 38, and so all the people I graduated college with are sort of mid-career now, right? And man, so many of my peers, I was off in the Peace Corps, or whatever, but a lot of my peers who were actually entered the job market right out of college, God, they were so frustrated when they were 22, when they were 24, when they were 26, were so frustrated and felt like they were banging their head against the wall professionally. But then now I look at where they're at, and they're doing so many amazing different things, right? So all these people who've gone on to be stratospherically successful, and they are, managing big teams at Nike and at the Defense Department and wherever, were so frustrated when they were 25 or 26 and feeling like such failures. So if you have some years of feeling really frustrated and failing a lot and not being able to land a job that really feels like it gives you direction towards something you want, that unfortunately is a part of the career trajectory for most of the people I graduated college with. And I think many of your peers will be going through the same thing. And again, it won't feel like it, because on Facebook, those of your friends who are already on this great path are going to be posting about it all the time. And those of your friends who are struggling like all hell and getting laid off or just can't find any job that's interesting, and working temp jobs and working jobs they hate, they're going to be posting about it less, right? It's going to feel like everybody's succeeding except you, but it's not actually going to be the case. But when you want to go to pivot from one field to another, it can be hard to convince firms that you're serious about it. But you're a management person, you're not a marketing person, or you're a writer. What do you mean you want a job doing math, right? You're an accountant. What do you mean you want to do that, right? Whatever it is, going back to grad school here can be really useful, right? So a lot of people, they may start out in marketing and they say, no, I really want to be in strategic management, or they start out and they're working, anyway, they want to change lanes. Going to grad school can be a great way to pivot and relaunch, right? Because grad school reconnects you with a whole set of career services and all these things, and you get to specialize in your program to sort of, you're like, oh yeah, no, I know I spent 5 years working as a management consultant, but then I went to graduate school and I got a degree doing, I got a degree in engineering, and now I'm going to be a programmer, right? It allows you to be like, you just point to that most recent degree as that's what I transitioned onto this path, and you have the career services, the placement pipeline, all this stuff. And so grad school can be a great transition. And otherwise, you just keep applying out from the field you're in until you're able to make the move. You do all the networking, the informational interviews, all that kind of stuff, build the relationships in that new field until you're finally able to make the move over. And it does often mean you've kind of advanced here in this field, and then you've got to kind of go back down to the entry level of that new field again. So it does, like, moving across silos can often mean taking a step back. But look, your careers are going to be really long. You guys are likely going to have 40, and like for many of you, 50-year-long careers, right? Stepping back 2 or 3 years down the ladder when you're on a 50-year career is a very worthwhile investment, right? Stepping back down that ladder hurts to do at the time, but your careers are very, very long. So getting in the right career is worth some sacrifices. Trading off sort of joy and purpose versus income is a really tricky proposition. And I think that trade-off is different for different people. And some of it is that people value, money does different things for you, right? Money doesn't just enable, it enables luxury consumption, but it also enables stability, safety, ability to provide for other people, including extended family and that sort of thing, and an ability to make a contribution to the world sort of via philanthropy, right? If you think about like, okay, who's going to have a bigger impact on the world in a positive way? Is it the person who graduates SIR and goes and works for development NGOs in sub-Saharan Africa for their whole career, and they're making, they're making peanuts, but man, they're in the trenches doing the good work, right? Or somebody who goes and works for a hedge fund and makes buku bucks and donates, 10% of their salary or 20% of their salary even every year for their career. Like, who's going to make a larger impact on the world or whatever, but also who's going to feel more fulfilled, right? One person is very connected to their good they're doing on the earth. The other person's day to day is all about sort of defeating the competition and getting higher returns. But then they're making this really large substantive impact with their financial donations, but they can't feel that. It doesn't feel as real. Trading that out, it ends. I realize this is an unsatisfying answer, quite likely, but it really depends on the individual, and it's sort of like, how close to your impact on the world do you want to be? How much does money matter to you? And again, like, saying money matters to me is not saying I'm a bad person, right? Because it matters for a lot of different reasons to different people. And it's not always a clean one-for-one trade-off too. There are a lot of people who are really miserable in jobs that don't pay very well, and people who are really happy in jobs that pay very well. So it's also not like you're gonna face some of you will face really clear choices where it's like, here's the job I'm confident I'm gonna love, that's gonna feel like I'm doing great things every day, and here's the job I'm not gonna like as much but pays twice as much. Some of you will face that clear dichotomy, but most of you, the trade-off's gonna be a little unclear as far as like how happy you're gonna be at this job versus that job. Sometimes working at an NGO can be exasperating because sometimes they're really poorly run and poorly managed. And you're working, and some NGOs that do great work in the world are also totally dysfunctional workplaces. And some firms where you're like, oh, that just seems like a firm that doesn't do much direct good in the world or whatever, but actually has this really supportive and wonderful workplace culture, and it's a wonderful place to go into work every day. And so I will say that actually office culture matters a lot to your well-being, and getting a sense of whether the organization you're going to be a part of has a supportive workplace culture that is a good fit for you matters a lot. Some people can handle a cutthroat, hyper-competitive workplace and actually kind of really thrive in that environment. Other people, not so much. Some people can handle a disorganized office environment, and we're kind of like, okay, the management is a little scattered, but you know what? Otherwise, it's a good place, so I like being here. And other people can't handle working in an organization where the upper management is disorganized and scattered. And so figuring out whether the workplace culture works for you is going to be, going into an office that you hate going into and going into a workplace that feels hostile to you or that feels unsupportive. It does affect your well-being a lot. Most of us spend something along the lines of 40, maybe even 50 hours a week in the office or doing work. And so whether or not we're happy in that environment, what you're doing matters a lot, but so does who you're doing it with. Who you're working alongside makes a huge difference in your well-being. Kind of what is the culture of that workplace. And then, Y2K just chatted in this question, which is obvious, which I expect is on a lot of your minds, is how should you change your post-graduation plans to deal with the long-term effects of coronavirus? So we've just transitioned from the strongest job market in a very, very long time to one of the worst job markets in a very, very long time. And it's gone like that, right? And so at the margins, staying in school for a couple of more years did just become a much better idea than it used to be. Certainly PhD programs became a much better idea than they used to be, but even debt finance master's degrees probably became a better idea than they used to be. So accelerating plans to go to graduate school can potentially make some sense. But also, depending on what industry you're going into, it's not immediately clear your employment prospects have gotten worse, right? The unemployment is through the roof right now, and a lot of industries have collapsed entirely for at least a while. But those may not have, most of the jobs that went away are not the jobs that all of you were seeking anyway, right? That most of you, that right now it is a really rough time to be a waiter or a waitress, to be a custodial worker in a hotel, or, a lot of, the whole hospitality industry has collapsed, right? And yes, that hits kind of the management side of hospitality as well, but it mostly is hitting all the lower wage workers in those industries, right? And, it's a terrible time to be in construction right now. It's a terrible time to be in a lot of these different things. But, the tech sector doing just fine right now, hiring lots of engineers and programmers and everything. And, so there's a lot of sectors out there. Entertainment sector is a mess because they can't shoot anything, but then there's the demand for their products is pretty high, but not in theaters. But, so I wouldn't write off, you may find you do just fine on the job market when you enter. So you may want to, so at the margins, the opportunity cost of graduate school might be lower than it used to be, right? How well you'd be doing in the employment market might be worse right now. But also, the opportunity costs of sort of taking some time off have gone down. And so, if you were thinking about doing volunteer work for a couple of years, doing AmeriCorps or Peace Corps or and the overseas stuff, like starting this summer, is going to be, obviously kind of tough. But for those of you who aren't graduating right now, but are graduating a year or two, if you're thinking about graduating a year from now, the job market's still going to be a year from now. And so the opportunity cost of a Peace Corps or an AmeriCorps or another kind of volunteer gig are somewhat lower, right? And so maybe thinking about, so at the margins, those things become better options. So you can think about sort of what things have become sort of relatively better or worse options. In general, starting salaries are going to be somewhat depressed. And so, and the probability of being unemployed if you're heading into the job market has increased. So doing things outside the job market for a couple of years has become a relatively better option. But many of you, even if you're graduating right now, or if you're graduating a year from now, are still going to graduate into great jobs, right? There will almost certainly be less on-campus recruiting happening next fall than there was this past fall, right? So in terms of the number of big firms that are doing a lot of hiring, it'll probably be lower this fall, right? So there's going to be more competition for the same slots. So, if you were planning on going through corporate recruiting, still go through corporate recruiting. But keep in mind, like if you don't get something, it's probably not a reflection entirely on you. It's a reflection on that market being much more competitive than in most years. And think about what are your backup options. So yeah, I mean, I think just, and think about which industries are likely to survive this well versus not, and perhaps rejiggering your thoughts to, well, are there opportunities in kind of what are growth industries right now that seem appealing to me? But it's also, I think it's a time to think about what's the positive impact you can have in the world in this time, right? You're young, you're at relatively low, for those of you who don't have pre-existing medical conditions and these kind of things, you're at relatively low risk of the virus. If you want to think about ways to have an amazing impact on the world, what if you spent a few weeks and got your EMT training, right? And go and work as an EMT for a year, before you launch into the next thing. Or go, think about, like, is there a frontline kind of position that I would be willing to take for a year or two? Like, yeah, being an EMT is not like a volunteer position, but being an EMT right now might be a better way to have a positive impact on the world than joining the Peace Corps, right? So think about, like, what's the contribution I might want to try to have right now? Can be a really good way to frame your professional choices. Because while it's going to be harder than normal to make money over the next couple of years, I would say it's probably easier than normal to have an extremely positive impact on the world. There is so much need in the world for people to do good work, whether that is finding ways to care for the elderly and keep them healthy, finding ways to provide medical services to enough people, finding ways to support and help people transition to figure out how to do more things safely. There is such a need for creativity in re-engineering the workplace to allow more work to get done without putting people in physical proximity to each other. We have to reimagine how restaurant layouts are going to work. We have to reimagine how construction projects can take place. We have to reimagine how manufacturing processes can be conducted. All these things that used to bring a lot of people into close contact with each other, but maybe don't have to. Figure out how to re-engineer those processes in creative ways, right? If you guys can bring ingenuity and creativity to that, you will do a tremendous amount of good in the world. And I think in general, we tend to do really well in our professional world if we organize it around what is the impact I can have on the world? What is the value I can create? And if you do things that are creating real value in the world, you can often find a path toward professional fulfillment, positive impact on the world, and even the financial remuneration piece, right? Because when you're creating a lot of economic value for the world, often there's a way to get paid for doing that. Or even if you're creating non-financial value in the world and you're doing something for free for a while, but you're creating a ton of value doing it, or for a low wage for a while, you're demonstrating so much excellence doing that that allows you to go take a high-paying job when you're done with that phase in your life. So those are some thoughts on that.